All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this first session slot. I'm very pleased that we have Professor Bernd Skiera today with us. And so I'm extremely excited to introduce this session to you. Before I will introduce the session, Professor Skiera, is everything working with the technology? All right, you're live and we can hear you. And the screen is also shared.
Ich kann nichts hören.
Okay, we can hear you.
Okay, jetzt good. Now I'm ready.
All right, perfect. We can hear you and we're ready to start if you are.
Okay, I would be ready. Sorry for the problems. I didn't hear the introduction, but I assume it was very nice.
Let's do it again because I was just about to get started.
Okay, sorry.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first session slot today. My name is Lucas Jürgensmeyer with Tech Academy, and I'm extremely excited to introduce the next speaker to you. Before I introduce Professor Skiera, some notes on the organizational things. We will now have a 20 to 25 minute talk. And after that, we have 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. So for that, I ask you to write your questions in the chat, and I will then pick up the questions and ask them to Professor Skiera. So let's now get to the topic and to the session. The speaker you're about to hear is an expert in everything that has to do with your data on the internet. So Professor Skiera holds the chair for e-commerce at Goethe University in Frankfurt. And one of his biggest projects right now is all about cookies. And you can think that it's not the cookies that you can eat, but it's the cookies that you will find on the internet and that you will leave there. So he's looking at all the data that you leave on the internet. And one of his main goals there is to assess the economic value of cookies on the internet. And related to that, he will today present his talk, How do GDPR and other privacy laws impact the online advertisement market? Okay, please join me in welcoming Professor Skiera. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucas, for the very nice introduction, and thanks for co-organizing the conference. It's an amazing event, and I'm very happy to be part of this event. What I would like to do in the following 25 minutes is to talk about the online tech industry and how it impacts the online advertising market. And I would like to start with a very brief description about the online advertising market before GDPR. And GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation that was introduced in the European Union on May 25th in 2018. And essentially, you have three players in the online advertising market. Those are the users over here. You have the publishers here, and the publisher is essentially the websites where you can see ads, but usually go there to read the content, for example, as would be the case for the New York Times. And we have the advertisers down here. And roughly speaking, the deal between the different parties is essentially as follows. The users quite often get the content free of charge, maybe not on the New York Times, but at many other newspaper websites. But in exchange, what the users do is they provide usually the publishers with data, and they also provide them with the opportunity to get contacted. And contacted quite often means you get exposed to advertising. So that's the first deal between the users and the publishers. And then the second deal between the advertiser and the publisher is essentially that the publisher provides the advertiser with some data and with the opportunity to contact the users. And in an exchange, the advertisers pay ad revenue to the publishers, and that's how they refinance their content. And then the third deal, probably implicitly, is that the advertisers would like to target the users with ads, and in exchange they hope that the users are purchasing something, and Purchasing essentially is broadly defined. It could be, of course, purchasing a product, but it could also be sign up for a new online newsletter, or could be sign up for a test drive of a car that might eventually be purchased offline later on. So this is how, roughly speaking, the online advertising market looks like. And core to all that is tracking, respectively, tracking technologies. Because what they do is essentially they allow to collect the data and then to transfer the data from one player to the other player. And what I would like to talk about is with GDPR, as you probably heard of, tracking is restricted and requires your consent. And how will that impact the online advertising market? So let me start briefly with tracking technologies. Essentially, there are three groups of tracking technologies. And the first one is not really a technology, but it's what's considered to be best for the companies. It's always the case if you log in to websites, because that has a huge advantage for the firm, because it allows to track the user, usually across devices. So it doesn't matter whether you log in from your desktop or from your smartphone or from your tablet. Whenever you log in, you identify yourself. And it also has the advantage that if you log in via different browsers, I can also track your behavior across the different browsers. And as I mentioned, the different devices. So that's the first tracking technology. The second one is usually called digital fingerprinting. And it builds upon a very simple idea, namely that the configuration, how you can set up your computer, your smartphone, and your browser, essentially there are so many different combinations that the likelihood that your combination is unique is extremely high. And if it's unique, then whenever I observe the same configuration, I can draw the conclusion that it has to relate to the same individual. So that's how essentially digital fingerprinting allows for tracking users. And the third one is what Lucas already mentioned. It's the cookies, not the cookies that you can eat, but the cookies are essentially small files that are stored on your browser. Okay, and if we look at GDPR, so that's the European Privacy Law, but I also outlined a few other laws that are currently implemented. For example, CCPA was implemented in February this year in California. India and Brazil also implemented privacy laws that are not exactly similar, but similar at least in terms of the spirit, that they would like to increase the privacy of the consumers. But in the following, I talk about GDPR, but to some extent you can draw the conclusion what we see for GDPR, that it would also hold for other privacy laws. And the idea is, as I outlined, is to increase the consumer privacy. And how does GDPR do it? It's essentially they regulate the use of personal data. And as you will see in the following, they picked the rather broad definition of personal data, which is namely any information that might be linked to an identifiable individual. And given that the tracking technologies, they want to identify individuals, of course, GDPR affects them quite strongly. But let me get back a second to the definition of personal data. I repeat it over here, any information that might be linked to an identified individual. And here you see a couple of examples. And I would like to highlight that, as I mentioned, the definition is rather broad. So if you think about typical offline identifiers, like, for example, your name, your home address, or let's say the ID card number and birthday, this is something you would say, okay, if I have that information, you would clearly say, okay, I also know the individual behind that information. If you move to online identifier, it's a bit more difficult. Let's say if you have my email address with Skiera at www.unifrankfurt.de, I think it's pretty clear that you can link this email address to my name. It's a little bit more difficult if you just have an email address like 123@gmail.com, then it's not as obvious. But of course, what you can do is that could be linked to an identifying individual. Also, if you have location data, if you have an IP address, if you have a cookie ID, this is what's considered to be personal data according to GDPR. So as you can see, it's a fairly broad definition of personal data. Okay, what is GDPR essentially doing? Well, roughly speaking, they provide more rights for users, and I don't focus on all the rights, but I focus on those rights that are most important for the online advertising industry. And the two rights that are fairly important is the first one, the object to the idea that you can object to data processing, and the second one is that the firms have to be transparent and quite informative. So what does it mean on the other side for companies? It forces them to fulfill more obligations. And the two obligations that are quite important for the online advertising market is that you need to have a legal basis for data usage and data processing. And essentially the two legal bases that are quite often used, the first one is what is called legitimate interest. And the arguments that could be behind legitimate interest, for example, could work as follows. You could argue that, for example, as a content provider, such as an online newspaper, you need to refinance via advertising and to realize high prices for the advertisement that is shown on your website. You would like to provide a lot of information, because you would argue, okay, I need the high prices for the advertising to refinance the content. So that's what you could try to use for legitimate interest. But it turned out the last 2 years, most courts essentially said, this is not going to work. So you cannot argue with legitimate interests in that case, as I just tried to outline. So that's what I want to highlight here, with the hurdle rate is rather high. So this is not going to work. The movement in the online advertising industry was clearly covered. You need to have the consent of the user, and you have to also specify the respective purposes. So what does it mean? Again, roughly speaking, we had that picture before. So what goes in between the user and the publisher is nowadays that you need the consent to collect the data from the user. So that's the consent that the advertiser need. If you want to move off data to the advertiser, what you need from the user is the consent to transfer the data. And also you need the consent between the user and the advertiser, namely the consent to use the data. So the user has to provide the advertiser with that respective consent. So this is roughly speaking what's going on. And so the first key takeaway, and I'm going to have 3 major key takeaway, is that nowadays, extremely often, consent is required for collecting and processing user data for advertising purposes. And that's what you've also seen with all the consent management banner that you have probably seen while surfing on the internet. But that's a very, very big movement going on. So let me dig a little bit deeper in terms of what are the constraints to collect the consent under GDPR. And without going into too much detail, but essentially the constraints are fairly high. So for example, it means that you need to get consent via an opt-in approach, which means that you explicitly have to say, I would like to provide the consent. And it's not an opt-out solution where, for example, the default choice would be that you give consent, and only if you actively add, you could get out of that default choice. You also have to give freely the consent, which means as a content provider, you cannot make the provisioning of the content dependent upon getting consent for example, collecting the data. That's not possible. And you have to fulfill other constraints, such as giving specific consent, informed consent, and also the consent has to be unambiguous. So to give you 2 examples, and here I repeat those constraints. The first one is an online consent banner, as you would see on a website such as Focus Online, and there are many more examples across the spirit of this consent banner. So the first one is it's an opt-in approach because you actively have to say, I'm going to accept given consent. And later on, you will also see it's freely because the consent cannot be, the content of the website cannot be linked to the consent over here. It also has to be an unambiguous consent. So here it's pretty clear that you have to say accept. You might want to argue whether the reject button, meaning you don't want to give the consent, whether that has to be displayed as prominently as the accept button, which is not the case over here. The law is not entirely clear on this one. And you can also see you get very specific categories for which you provide the consent. So if you were to look at the law, I would say this is pretty much in line with the spirit of the law. I show you a second banner, the one you have seen in particular early after GDPR or even before, which essentially say, okay, whenever you continue to use the website, essentially you have given the consent for collecting data, for storing cookies. So that would not be fully in line with an opt-in approach. It would rather be an opt-out approach. So as you can see, there's a wide range. It's not always fully clear what is in line with the law, and also, in some cases, we are still waiting for decisions from judges upon what is feasible or not. But this gives you an idea upon that there's a wide range of opportunities to collect the consent. So let me come back to the main parties of the online advertising industry and set them up slightly differently. So now we have the user on the left-hand side, we have the publishers, meaning the websites where the ads are shown, and we have the advertisers over here. What I would like to highlight two things. First of all, I will elaborate a bit more upon the situation that essentially only the publisher is in direct contact to the user, and everyone else in the online advertising industry quite often doesn't have immediate contact to the user, as you can see here for the advertiser. And the second thing I would like to highlight is that the advertising market is actually much more complicated. So what you see here is essentially the same picture as I just showed you over here. The only difference is that here you can nowadays see there are many more players involved. And I don't want to get into all the detail why those players are involved, but I just want to make the message that the advertising market is much more complicated than just the user, the publisher, and the advertiser. For example, we have supply-side platforms in here that essentially help the publishers to sell the ads. We have demand-side platforms here that essentially help the advertisers to buy ads. We have so-called ad exchanges over here. Those are marketplaces where in real time, using auctions, the ads that could be shown to the users are sold to the advertisers, and we have many more parties being involved here. So let's come back to the very simple situation. What is new that we nowadays have the user going to the publisher, and that we have nowadays what's called a consent management platform, which is involved. And essentially the consent management platform shows up those tiny little banner ads, consent banners, where the user then has the choice to provide or not to provide the consent. So why is it important to get or to not get the consent from the publisher's perspective? Well, let's assume you would get the consent from the user. Then it essentially means tracking is possible. If you track, that usually allows also to better target your ads, which means that you can use the information about the user to come up what you consider to be the best ad. And usually that's an ad that you can sell at a much higher price than untargeted ads. So essentially, if you get the consent, the publisher, and of course also the advertiser, they continue to conduct business as usual. Business as usual means compared to a situation where we didn't have GDPR, so they can continue to do behavioral targeting and other things. What is the consequence for the publisher of not getting consent? Well, that means that tracking is not feasible. That means that behavioral targeting of the ads is not feasible. And sometimes even you have the situation where no advertisement at all is feasible, because some of the technology providers that help the publisher to set up the ads, they only work or collaborate with the publisher if they have consent. So if you look at what we call consent rate, which is the percentage of users who opt in or who provide the consent, those consent rates for the cookie management or cookie consent banners, that can easily vary in the area of 10 to 90%. So as you can see, this is a very, very high rate. That certainly depends upon who's the publisher, how trustworthy is the publisher, but that also depends very much, quite strongly, on how you design the consent banner ad, in which way that can have a strong impact on the consent rate. So where you are in the range between 10 and 90%. So the key takeaway too is that getting consent for the publisher himself and other players, as I just outlined, that operate in the online tech industry, that really provides a huge advantage. So let me come to the third implication. And I would like to briefly highlight that the industry started to develop what they call a transparency and consent framework, which is called TCF. That one is very prominent. It's developed by the Interactive Advertising Bureau in Europe. So it's essentially a large association where lots of players of the online advertising industry are involved. And what I would like to show you here, there's been quite a rapid development of different standards. The first one was the TCF 1.1 standard. Now we're in the TCF version 2 standard. And essentially, I would like to highlight what I'm going to show you in the following is really a very, very recent development. So this kind of framework is kind of state of the art and is currently still developing a bit forward. So what is core to this framework is what is called a consent string. And essentially what the consent string does is the following. You ask the user to get consent for different purposes, how you would like to collect and work on the process the data. So for example, in this case here, the consent string would consist of 5 times the 1 because the user might have given consent for the first 5 purposes. And then you have a very long list of vendors. And vendors are essentially the players in the online advertising market. And for some of them, you would get consent, for example, for the SSP 1 and 2, that would be the supply side platform. You get consent for the first ad exchange, so there would be 3 ones here. And then for the second ad exchange, you don't get consent and so forth. So essentially, if you say something for the consent management banner, that would be stored in a consent string. And subsequently, I would like to provide you a very simple example about how that actually works nowadays. And in this example, we have 3 players. We have the user, we have a publisher who operates a website, and we have the consent management platform. So a very, very simple case, you go to, for example, a newspaper website, and the newspaper website would just like to get consent for what the website is doing, not for any kind of additional partners or firms that the publisher is collaborating with. So how does it work? The user visits the website. Then the website contacts the consent management platform, the CMP. We have a consent management tech. What the consent management platform is doing, they check the existence of this transparency and consent string that I just mentioned. And what it essentially does, the consent management platform goes to what is considered the local storage. That's usually a cookie that is stored. That is stored on in the browser of the user A, and checks whether whether a TC string exists there or not. Let's assume the TC string is not found there. So, which means that so far the user has not been asked for the consent, or maybe the user deleted its cookies. And that means we have to ask the user for providing consent. So what you will see next is a banner showing up. And for example, is saying something like, we value your privacy and we would like to get your consent for using personalized content, for measuring the performance of the content, and many other things. We just focus here on 2 examples. And now the user has to make a choice. And of course, it has to be an opt-in choice. And let's say in this example, the user would say, okay, you can personalize my content, but I don't allow you to measure the performance of the content, which could, for example, mean you're not allowed to recall whether I click on something or not. So what then happens is that the consent management platform creates a string. The string is encoded, and that one is sent to the publisher. And the publisher then stores the TC string locally for a particular user, for example, as a cookie. What it then does is that the publisher also accesses, again, the CMP via an API to get the information about what is stored in that string. So essentially, it's decoded what kind of privacy information I have. And then the website is using this information to provide the respective service or the ads based upon the user A's privacy preference. So this is what's going on in the background if you were wondering about what is going on with all those consent management banners. And as I mentioned, this was a very simple example. If we look at something that's a bit more closer to a real world setting, you can see the publisher over here, and you see all kind of additional players here in the industry. And you, as a user, you might have given consent. And might have given consent in that case would mean we have some players that have the consent here marked in green, and other players marked in red for those players who didn't provide the consent. And if you just think about that, what we did, what I just showed you, the example, just related to getting consent for the publisher over here, and did not involve any more didn't involve getting the consent for other players in the online advertising market. I think it becomes clear that this is actually this is something that is fairly complex and involves a lot of technology. So my third key takeaway is that managing the consent is fairly difficult and requires some kind of industry standard. It could be the TCF2, which I just mentioned, or it could be another standard. And maybe Germany would also like to decide to move forward developing their own standard. But it's clear if you would like to manage so many different players in the online advertising industry, it can't be a proprietary solution that would differ, for example, across one player and another player. So this is what I feel is important. So let's come back to the question of the conference with my final slide. The question is, can tech save the advertising world? And I think it has become hopefully clear that managing privacy in the online advertising world is a very, very big challenge. Technology can help there. So I would say I'm pretty convinced that tech can save the advertising world, but what is important, you also need to have consent. Without the consent, it's going to be very, very difficult. You wouldn't have any data. Without data, probably the technology is not too useful. So I would say for the next time, at least for the next time, the online advertising industry for the near future, it's really important to work on different methods to get the respective consent, or alternative to treat the data in a different form as was done until now to keep the privacy of consumers. With that, I would like to thank you. I would like to give you a small picture of the team I'm working with. All the people you can see here, they contributed to this presentation, and I'm now looking forward for the questions. Thanks for taking the time to attend this presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Bernd Skiera, for this nice presentation. And I'm gonna start asking the questions now. So a quick reminder to the audience, if you have questions, please ask them in the chat now. And so my first question would be picking up on some of the things you said in the last part. You yourself as a researcher, you're extremely dependent on data. So what do you think? Are we too careless with our data on the internet because you see that from the other side? Or do you personally, as a researcher, appreciate how much data there is to analyze?
That's very difficult to say. Let me outline two extreme points. I don't think a world where the firms could do whatever they would like to do with consumer data would be a good world. And that also involves researchers, but primarily firms. So if there's no privacy, I don't think this is a good world. On the other side, if you come up with a world where essentially firms could not use any of the data about consumers, that's probably also not a good world, because it would instantly mean that all the publishers wouldn't have the opportunity to refinance their content via advertising. And that would more or less instantly mean that you have to come up with what is called paid content, which means that you wouldn't essentially get content free of charge on the internet. And that might be acceptable for everyone who has a sufficient amount of money to pay for the content. But that are unfortunately not the majority of the people. We have a lot of people out there. And I think overall, a major share of people benefited that information was provided free of charge. And with free of charge, I mean a price of zero. There was always a price to pay. And in the past, I mean, people have paid with data. But what I would like to highlight, neither the one situation where everyone can use whatever data could be collected, nor the other situation, no data collected at all, is a world I feel would be beneficial. So somewhere in between has to be the optimum. And the question is, how can we find that optimum? And with my research, I would like to contribute towards finding this optimal point.
Okay, thanks for that answer. So the next question is from our audience, and those would be two very short questions from Malte. So Malte is asking, first of all, probably a very representative question for all the consumers on the internet. Why are even some cookies necessary at all? So why do you need cookies at all? And the second question is, if you have a publisher and you don't consent with that, with the cookie usage, are they even allowed to show you anything at all?
Thanks, Malte, for those questions. First of all, what I try to highlight is that there are alternative tracking technologies. There's cookies out there, there is digital fingerprinting, and there's login data. So if the online newspapers manages that you always log in if you want to read their newspaper, that would essentially allow them to drop all cookies. So that would be an alternative tracking technology. So that's also the motivation of a number of publishers to incentivize you to come up with an account, to log in there, because that allows them to track your behavior, given you also provided them with consent. So that's a little bit the idea behind that one. The second one is if you look at, for example, what's called a poor model, that's the model, for example, Der Spiegel in Germany is pursuing, what you recognize when you go to their web page, they offer you a choice between either accepting cookies or tracking technologies more generally, or they offer you a paid version where they essentially say no tracking, no advertising is going on. And now you might say, well, didn't I tell you a few minutes ago that it has to be a free choice whether you want to provide data or not? And you might say, okay, but the Spiegel just offers me two alternatives: providing the data or paying for not being tracked. And that's actually a decision that was made by the Data Protection Agency in Hamburg, which is a bit controversial. So, for example, Baden-Württemberg has a different perspective on that one, because if you are a newspaper website and you just offer one alternative, not a paid version, but then you can't link the consent choice to whatever kind of information you would provide later on. And in the case of the Spiegel, you can choose between two alternatives. And the argument of the Data Protection Agency in Hamburg was that the paid version is actually not so expensive that people cannot afford it. So what is clear from that line of argument, if the paid version would be very expensive, that would not be acceptable. But given the price is not too high, and Hamburg said charging €5 per month is not a price that is too high, then in that case, it would be acceptable. So that was the second one. I'm not sure whether you had a third one.
I think we can get to the third one later. So let me ask the question from Sai. So we just heard from the Federal Data Protection Officer this morning. And so the question is based on that. In Germany, what is the entity in charge of keeping the online business accountable? So ensuring that users have given their consent. Is it the federal one, or is it probably the one from the states, or is that just a huge mess?
Well, whether it's a huge mess or not, I leave that up to others to decide. But many of those decisions are made on the state level. And as I just outlined, for the pure model that is employed by Spiegel, obviously Spiegel is located in Hamburg, so the Data Protection Agency of Hamburg is responsible. They were in favor of the pure model. As I heard in Baden-Württemberg, the Data Protection Agency has a different perspective on that one. And so what we currently face is we could easily have a situation that, let's say, a news publisher being located in Baden-Württemberg or maybe also in Bavaria might end up with, let's say, a different legal environment compared to the situation in Hamburg, because there's simply a different interpretation done. And that's, of course, something that's getting close to what you just consider to be a mess.
Also, our audience seems to be very interested in that issue. So Selina is asking, what are good ways of finding common regulations for the federal states in Germany for data protection mechanisms?
That's actually very, very difficult. There are some initiatives going on also by BDVW, so that's the Association of Digitale Werbewirtschaft in Germany. First of all, it's not entirely transparent how all the different cases were evaluated. And secondly, then you also face a bit the situation that not all companies are fully interested in revealing what happened to them. So in that sense, I think Celine is asking a good question. It would be very, very nice to know what are common regulations. Personally, I would also be in favor of having a kind of unified framework across all states in Germany. But currently we are, from my point of view, a bit away from that situation.
And we have one more question from Malte, and he would like to know, do you think that the quality of online news will suffer because newspapers have lower revenues if maybe some people don't give their consent?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's an empirical question, but my prediction is rather clear, and I think it's also intuitively appealing. Somehow you need to finance the content, and good content requires a lot of work. So it's a labor-intensive task. And if the revenue stream is going to drop, I mean, probably it's difficult to keep the same cost level. And if you look at the overall profit that is generated in the newspaper industry, we are not talking about an industry that makes a huge amount of profit. So in that case, I would simply say, if the consent rates are going to drop, the publishers will have lower revenue, and that will have implications on their cost structure. So they need to save costs, and I would say it's very likely that they are also that they have to sacrifice with respect to the quality of the content.
Thank you very much, Professor Bernd Skiera, for this very interesting talk, and thank you for answering all those questions. And also thank you very much to the audience for sending me your questions and for listening to this talk. Thank you so much, Professor Bernd Skiera.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and we will continue our program in 3 minutes with the next sessions, and you can join the other sessions, which will be from Alidios, that's a quantitative hedge fund. We will have a session from Microsoft. I think no introduction needed for that. And then the last one will be from Synonis, which is a Munich-based unicorn startup, which has very interesting software. So feel free to join the other sessions, and I hope you will enjoy the next sessions of this conference.